The hot summer sun beat down upon the hayfields on the first day of August 1867. Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg and 23 soldiers of the newly formed 27th Infantry Regiment, along with 12 civilians, were under attack with a mixed force of 600 to 800 Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota warriors. These men would spend 6 hours under siege, even though Fort C.F. Smith lay not 3 miles from the haycutters' camp. Desperately outnumbered and surrounded, these men would defy the odds and hold their own, thanks in part to their defensive position and the newly issued infantry rifle that allowed the soldiers to fire as fast as the bows carried by the native warriors. This battle would mark the beginning of Red Cloud's last major offensive operation in his fight for the Powder River Country. Join us as we dive into Part 7 of our series on Red Cloud's War, the Hayfield Fight.
Well, every road I see leads away from me.
You're listening to the Tales of the Trails podcast, produced by Duke Frazier Productions in association with the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. I'm your host, Duke Frazier.
Saying, friend, come see what's round the bend. So is it any wonder that I roam?
On August 4th, 1866, Captain Nathaniel Kinney, along with 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion of the 18th U.S. Infantry, marched out of Fort Phil Kearny northward along the Bozeman Trail. Kinney's orders were to select a location near the Bighorn River and establish the third and final ford along the Bozeman Trail. Led by famed mountain man Jim Bridger, Kinney would arrive at the Bighorn on August 12th. Fort C.F. Smith would be built on a shelf overlooking the Bighorn River only a couple miles from the mouth of the Bighorn Canyon. Its location was strategic, being 400 yards from the ferry where the Bozeman Trail crossed the Bighorn River. A natural spring with good water, timber nearby on Limekiln Creek, and a meadow in the valley below to provide hay for the livestock made the location all the more tenable. The structure of Fort C.F. Smith consisted of a stockade with 125 yards of wall built of logs and adobe. The strategic position allowed Fort C.F. Smith to have a commanding view up to 3 miles in any direction. As construction began on the fort, the tide of immigrants traveling the Bozeman Trail was beginning to wane. On August 16th, a wagon train consisting of 260 wagons passed by the beginnings of the fort, the last major group to pass this way to the Montana goldfields. The native warriors continued to harass travelers and soldiers on the trail. Attacks had grown so frequent that most immigrants chose to take the other routes to the Montana goldfields. Only one more wagon train would pass the fort in 1866. Soldiers continued construction of the fort through the winter with storehouses, officers' quarters, and barracks for the soldiers being constructed. In November of 1866, the 2nd Battalion of the 18th U.S. Infantry would be redesignated as the 27th U.S. Infantry. While soldiers continued with the daily construction, the brutal winter began to set in. Communication with Fort Phil Kearny would cease for a time due to weather conditions. Fort C.F. Smith would receive word of the Fetterman fight first from the nearby Crow. Official word would not arrive until the 7th of February, 1867. Rations soon began to run out. Soldiers were forced to eat corn originally intended for the livestock. Some relief came on the 2nd of February when John Richard, or Reshaw, Jr., arrived with 4 wagons loaded with potatoes and butter. Along with John were his brother Louis, brother-in-law Baptiste Poirier, also known as Big Bat, and Mitch Boyer. Boyer would sign on at Fort C.F. Smith as a scout. The situation at Fort C.F. Smith was beginning to become dire, and with the spring, Red Cloud began to take up offensive operations. On the 26th of May, Lakota warriors ran off some of the fort's horses. A small detachment pursued a short distance, but fear of a repeat of the Fetterman fight prevented the soldiers from pursuing further. As June approached, the Stars and Stripes would finally fly over Fort C.F. Smith, with the flagpole finally being completed on the 1st. Reinforcements and supplies would finally arrive 10 days later. Spirits brightened with a new supply of goods and the addition of another company of troops. But Red Cloud's war was far from over. Despite the fact that Red Cloud was fighting to close the Bozeman Trail, the trail itself actually ran through territory recognized at that time to belong to the Crow. While the Crow were not pleased with the increased traffic on the trail, they still maintained friendly relations with the Anglos. They would often trade with the soldiers and provide information on the activity of Red Cloud's alliance. As the summer continued on, harassment by the warriors would also continue. On the 23rd of July, Lieutenant Colonel Luther Bradley arrived to take command of Fort C.F. Smith, bringing with him 2 additional companies of soldiers. 5 companies now manned the post. He had also brought with him new arms and ammunition. They were the second model Allen conversion Springfields. These muzzle-loading muskets had been modified to accept new 50-70 self-contained centerfire metallic cartridges, which made them more efficient in the fact that they loaded from the breech. Whereas a soldier armed with a standard musket could only fire 3 rounds per minute, the new rifles could easily fire 8 rounds per minute or more. These new arms would prove themselves worthy 9 days after their arrival. On the 30th of July, Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg took command of the soldiers detailed to guard the Hayfields. The soldiers had received word from friendly Crow Indians that they would be attacked soon. D.A. Al Colvin stated that the night before there was an Indian came to our camp. I think he was a Sioux Indian who had married into the Crow tribe, and he said, "When the sky is here," pointing to the sky about 11 o'clock, "the whole face of the earth will be covered with Indians." Al Colvin, along with his brother Zeke, were among the 12 civilians who worked as hay cutters. Both had served during the Civil War. Finn Burnett, a former Confederate soldier, Albert Stevenson, Robert Little, John Hollister, George Duncan, William Hayes, B.F. Hardwood, Robert Wheeler, and Albert Howard made up the rest of the number. All the men were well armed, with several Spencers, a Henry, 2 newly released Winchester rifles, an Enfield, and a Ballard breech loader, and several double-barrel shotguns. And all the men had Colt revolvers. The enlisted men at the Hayfield included Sergeant James Norton, Charles Bradley, Francis Law, James Lockwood, Henry Vinson, Thomas Navin, Thomas Roach, John Cahill, Richard Cullew, James Levy, Randolph Rathiel, George Brambier, Thomas Riley, Edward Halloran, David Flyeve, Frederick Letters, Joseph Hungholt, James Brogan, John Thompson, and Privates Gallagher, Noiser, Kleiner, and Burkhart. These men came from companies D, E, G, H, and I of the 27th Infantry. As the men were waiting for lunch about 11 o'clock, Private Bradley fired his rifle and began riding towards the corral. The corral had been built of heavy logs and woven willow boughs, forming a square 100 by 100 feet. The running gear of wagon fashioned a gate on the south entrance. Inside the corral, 4 tents served as quarters for the soldiers, with 1 for the lieutenant and 3 for the enlisted men. 4 wagon boxes with covers formed living quarters for the civilians. The civilian hay cutters took up their arms and began running 3/4 of a mile back to the corral. Al Colvin stated, "It was the handsomest sight I ever saw in my life. Everything was excitement, and everybody grabbed his gun and the fight was on." As the men began preparing for a fight, Lieutenant Sternberg ordered the men to fall in outside of the barricade and take up positions in rifle pits that had been dug around the perimeter. Al Colvin realized Sternberg was about to make a fatal error and asked Sternberg if he was crazy. Sternberg replied by asking who was in command of this place. Al Colvin responded, "A man who does not know anything about fighting Indians." Colvin then told the men to take up prone positions inside the corral. The warriors made their first charge upon the corral shortly after the soldiers took their positions. The charge split both directions around the corral when met by fire from the defenders. Thinking the soldiers were armed with muzzleloaders, the warriors came within 50 feet of the corral, but the lead kept coming. Soon the warriors broke their attack and took shelter. During the first attack, Sergeant Norton was shot in the hand. Lieutenant Sternberg stood up and picked up Norton's revolver, telling the rest of the men to stand and fight like men. A bullet from a warrior hidden in a tree smashed into Lieutenant Sternberg's temple, killing him instantly. Thomas Navin was the next to be killed, following Sternberg's orders to stand and fight. Though few warriors had firearms, those that did so began firing into the corral from the cliffs 300 yards distant. The rest poured arrows into the corral, wounding most of the mules and killing several others. Hoping that the defenders had been wounded in the barrage, the warriors made their second attack. Once again, they were repulsed. Again, Sergeant Norton would be wounded, this time in the shoulder, and civilian J.G. Hollister was wounded in the stomach. Al Colvin would take the lead in the remainder of the fight, telling the soldiers not to fire unless they were sure to kill a man or a horse. He maintained a cool composure and helped inspire the men. The second attack having failed, the warriors fell back and again began to barrage the corral with arrows and bullets. Nearly every half hour, the warriors would charge around the corral. Al Colvin instructed Albert Howard to sling insults at the warriors as he spoke the Lakota language. Many braves tried to sneak up close to the corral, either to get a lucky shot or to force the soldiers to waste ammunition. One warrior managed to steal several loaves of bread from the cook tent. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the warriors decided to use a new tactic. They set fire to the stacks of hay on the east side of the corral. It appeared that the warriors would be successful in killing the defenders. As the flames rolled up within 20 feet of the corral, they suddenly stopped their advance and rose as high as 40 feet in the air. Then, as quickly as they advanced, they burned out. The grass immediately encircling the corral had been stomped to dirt, saving the men inside from a terrible death. 2 more charges would come in the mid-afternoon, each being repulsed. The final attack would come at the south entrance across Warman Creek. As the final attack commenced, Colvin instructed the men to use shotguns on the warriors on foot. Finn Burnett had Al Leeton's double-barrel 10-gauge loaded with 16 buckshot in each barrel. He killed 2 warriors. One was so close Burnett nearly decapitated him. As the rest of the charge came down the hill, Colvin and the rest delivered a volley into the warriors. Colvin delivered a fatal shot into a Lakota chief, Bear That Grabs. The warriors were unable to retrieve his body, and soon the defenders heard the wail of grief. Several more attempts were made to retrieve Bear That Grabs, but soon they began to pull back. As darkness approached, it became apparent that the defenders would not be able to hold out through the night. Colvin wrote out a message for Colonel Bradley. "We have 3 dead and 5 wounded. We will be unable to defend the corral after dark. If you are a man, send us relief. If you are a devil, go to hell where you ought to be." Private Charles Bradley, who had proven himself less than useful during the fight, volunteered to carry the message. Mounted on a horse, Bradley began his 3-mile ride back to the fort. At first, no warriors were spotted, but suddenly several appeared and began chasing Private Bradley to the fort. As Bradley arrived within 150 yards from the stockade, a pursuing warrior managed to touch him on the back with a bow. Colonel Bradley had the gates of the fort shut earlier in the day when the attack began. He had also ordered the men not to exit the fort. Defying orders, several men opened the gates and fired upon Private Bradley's pursuers. Colonel Bradley, despite having ordered the gates shut, had sent out a small detachment of mounted soldiers and civilians shortly before Private Bradley arrived, but they were engaged before arriving at the Hayfields. Lieutenant Shirley, who led this detachment, began to withdraw back to the fort. Captain Burrows would be sent to Lieutenant Shirley's relief with Company G. Company H, under command of First Lieutenant Reuben Fenton, along with a 12-pound mountain howitzer, were sent directly behind. As these 2 detachments approached the corral, they succeeded in driving back the attackers. 2 rounds fired from the mountain howitzers convinced the warriors to give up the field completely. The men gathered what they could, and the order to burn the rest was given. Before leaving the field, the defenders looted and mutilated the body of Bear That Grabs. As the defenders and rescuers fell back to the fort, warriors continued to harass them. Finally, a volley of canister would convince the Indians to give up the field completely. 3 of the defenders were dead. Estimates vary on the number of native warriors killed, from as little as 8 to as many as 50. The following day, Lieutenant Sternberg and Private Navin were buried with full honors. John Hollister was buried on Graveyard Hill on the 5th. Colonel Bradley would come under scrutiny for his actions, or lack thereof, during the attack. While it was apparent that Colonel Bradley was aware of the fight by 1 in the afternoon, it wasn't until 4 that the relief columns were sent out. Both Al Eaton and Al Colvin stated that he knew nothing of fighting Indians. Despite the overwhelming odds, the men inside the corral at what would become known as the Hayfield fight managed to defend their position for nearly 6 hours. The new breech-loading weapons had proven themselves. Despite their success, they would be put to the test again the following day at Fort Phil Kearny. Next time on Tales of the Trails. As the Hayfield fight concludes at Fort C.O. Smith, Ragclad prepares to make a second attack at Fort Phil Kearny. In a nearly identical battle to the Hayfield fight, the defenders of the Wagon Box fight will withstand an 8-hour siege.
All the places I have been.
Tales of the Trails was produced by Duke Frazier Productions. Music performed by Garrett Woods from the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. Sources for this episode may be found in the description field below. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. Click the bell to receive notification of new episodes. Until next time, keep your powder dry.
Calls me as it goes.